call this meeting to order. So welcome to meeting number 50 of the House of Commons Standing Committee on Public Safety and National Security. We will start by acknowledging that we are meeting on the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin people. Today's meeting is taking place in a hybrid format pursuant to the House Order of November 25th, 2021. Members are attending in person in the room and remotely using the Zoom application. I'll note that we have until 1:30, if it is the will of the committee to meet to that till that time. And of course, everyone has the ability to move an adjournment earlier if it is the will to do so. So pursuant to the order of reference of Thursday, June 23rd, 2022, the committee is resuming consideration of Bill C-21, an act to amend certain acts and to make certain consequential amendments firearms. I will welcome back the officials who are once again with us today. They are available for technical questions regarding the bill. So from the Department of Justice, we have Marianne Brice, Counsel for Public Safety Canada Legal Services, Paula Clark, Counsel, Criminal Law Policy Section, Phaedra Glushek, Counsel, Criminal Law Policy Section. From the Department of Public Safety and Emergency Preparedness, we have Rachel Mainville-Dale, Acting Director General, Firearms Policy. So thank you for joining us today. So we will resume clause by clause. Motion G40 has been moved, and I see Mr. Chang wishes to make a. Sorry. G4. Sorry, G4. I recognize Mr. Chang.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. In our previous meeting, there was a great deal of discussion surrounding the list contained in G46. Therefore, I'm seeking the unanimous consent of this committee to release the list of firearms that are contained in Amendment G46. Mr. Chair, to be clear, I'm not moving the amendment. I'm simply seeking the consent of members of this committee to release the list contained therein, which includes all firearms contained in the definition we are discussing in this committee. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Chang. Is it the will of the committee to? Is there anyone opposed? Yes, Mr. Lloyd.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just something that Mr. Chang said somewhat confused me. He said he's not moving a motion, but he's seeking unanimous consent. Would he have to move a motion on this and before seeking unanimous consent?
He's not moving G46.
No, of course.
He's just asking the consent of the committee to release it publicly.
But does he have to move a motion to ask the committee for unanimous consent to release this publicly?
Strictly no. It's his motion. It's his privilege that is at stake here. He's willing to give it up, but he has moved unanimous consent. So that is the really the vote on the floor for us right now. Is there any dissent? Go ahead.
Just a question of clarification. So if they're not moving this but introducing it for discussion, does that mean then that we can't say, I move to remove X hunting rifle from this list? I just want to be clear of what our powers are if now we can discuss it, but it isn't technically moved, so can we not amend it or just...
We cannot amend it until it's moved. It can't be moved until later on in the bill. But
so it's not being moved right now.
But it is not being moved at this time. It is, but there's a lot of concern about what's actually in the list and so forth. I know that you guys are very rightly concerned about that, and you were asking the officials. Puts the officials in pretty much of a box. They can't really tell you. So Mr. Chang is really releasing his privilege, but he's asking for the consent of the committee to do that. So once again, I'll ask if there is any dissent and anyone who opposes Mr. Chang's unanimous consent motion. Seeing none, I believe it is passed. So the contents of motion G46 are now publicly accessible. I would also note that in the version of that motion that had been previously distributed to the committee, there were something around page 417 it's going to be really good bedside reading. Something around page 417, the formatting went all awry. So the clerk has arranged for a reprint of that, and it will have been distributed to all the members at this point. So that being the case, I believe Mr. Moff was next. Go ahead.
Thanks, Chair. First, I just want to get on the record that the Canadian Shooting Sports Association sent an email overnight on Tuesday night that included reference and actual wording of the amendments which were submitted to the clerk and have not yet been moved. As members know, these are supposed to be confidential until moved. So this is a breach of parliamentary privilege, and I have sent a message to the Speaker asking him to look into it. So I just want members to know that our privilege was breached by these amendments being leaked, and they have been shared publicly. I'd also like this opportunity, Chair, to make some comments on what happened on Tuesday. I listened to the Conservatives ramble on here, and I just want to set the record straight. So first, I just want to make clear that we are not going after hunters. We're looking to remove weapons that were designed for the battlefield from our society. This is something that the UK did in 1988, outlawing semi-automatic weapons, Australia in 1996, and Australia restricted ownership of semi-automatic weapons in 96, and New Zealand in 2019. The amendment is not a backdoor, as has been suggested. It will codify in the criminal code assault weapons that were banned in 2020 and making a clear definition of the specifications of these guns that were designed for war. We're adding them to the criminal code to make sure that any future government will have to amend the criminal code in order to make these military-style assault weapons available again. Right now, as they are listed through Order in Council, any government could add or remove firearms as they see fit. Now that the list is public, thanks to my colleague's motion this morning, the amendment proposed in sub G are forward-looking. It provides an evergreen definition in the criminal code to ensure that new makes and models of assault-style firearms are unable to enter the Canadian market. The reason we need this amendment is to ensure that gun manufacturers can't tweak designs of prohibited weapons and have them available in Canada again. Codification and clear definitions in the criminal code will ensure that manufacturers can't try to game the system to continue to sell weapons, which by any other name would be prohibited. It also provides clarity. As the Conservatives like to say, we banned guns because they look scary, which is not the case, but now we're providing a very clear definition, not on the look of a weapon, but on its very specific design specification. So let's get into some specifics here. A firearm capable of discharging a projectile with a muzzle energy exceeding 10,000 joules is a high-caliber sniper rifle. A firearm with a bore diameter of 20 millimeters or greater is a grenade launcher. Hunters will still have firearms available to them to hunt. To say otherwise, as the Conservatives have been doing, is untrue. What will not be available are weapons designed for the battlefield. We're putting a clear definition in the criminal code of weapons that have no place in our society. Let me remind the committee that we're just less than 2 weeks away from December 6th, the National Day of Remembrance and Action on Violence Against Women. The anniversary of the day that a law-abiding gun owner with a legally obtained semi-automatic rifle separated the men from the women and slaughtered 14 women and injured 14 others at École Polytechnique. Now, the gun lobby, when they were here, dismissed this attack as an outlier event, but sadly it's not. The Quebec City mosque shooter had legally obtained weapons when he perpetrated an act of hate, when he opened fire, killing 6 and seriously injuring 5 others. In the Dawson College shooting, the perpetrator had a restricted firearms license, legally obtaining a semi-automatic weapon that killed 1 person and injured 19. Mr. Chang, my colleague, mentioned the SKS that was used on 2 police officers in Ontario just a couple of weeks ago. That's why in 2020, since 2020, we've been taking action to ban these military-style assault weapons, and that's why Amendment 4 is essential in fulfilling our commitment to ban all military-style assault weapons. Now it's up to the Conservatives to justify why these weapons designed for war should be legal again. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Demoff. I believe it's Mr. Lloyd, followed by Ms. Danchel. Ms. Danchel, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I appreciate that the Liberals have finally put some words on the record of their objectives here. A couple things. There's a lot to unpack of what Ms. Damoff said. She seemed to be equating the vile killer of École Polytechnique with hunters and blaming hunters for the deaths of 14 people. Perhaps she could clarify if she's blaming hunters who have legitimate hunting rifles. Is that what you're saying, Ms. Damoff?
You may answer if you wish.
And then I'd like to respond.
Brief answer. And then we'll go to Mr. Lloyd and then Mr. Fortin. Brief answer if you wish.
Thanks, Chair. I am absolutely not equating hunters with the perpetrator of that shooting. However, the weapon that was used in that shooting and others are included in this legislation, included in this amendment. They are weapons that are not needed by hunters. They are weapons that are designed for the battlefield. There are still firearms that will be available for hunters, but I think it needs to be clear, and people seem to like to deny the fact that those firearms that were used, those weapons that were used at École Polytechnique were legally obtained.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, for the clarification. So, again, we're having an argument here or a debate here about the fact that hunters have hunting rifles that have hurt people. And so what concerns me, Mr. Chair, is that the Liberals are able to use that argument for every firearm. So what I do believe is they're introducing this argument so that they can have the ability to carry that for banning every single firearm model in this country. The long list that they've just now formally introduced, that we can now talk about it, one of them on there is like a model of a .22 rifle. A .22 rifle is a rifle that you use for bird hunting or small rodents. This is possibly one of the most common styles of firearms, a .22. Anyone who has any knowledge whatsoever, whether they're a hunter or not, about hunting rifles, a .22 to put on the list of banned and called a military weapon is very deeply misinformed. Mr. Chair, we're reviewing this list in detail because there are so many firearms on here that are very, very, very commonplace. She mentions the SKS. That is one of the most commonplace hunting rifles, particularly popular in the Indigenous community. She likened it to a weapon of war, like an AR, like an AK-47 fully automatic. SKS is not that, Mr. Speaker, and it's disinformation to insinuate that they are. Fully automatic weapons, which are weapons of war, have been fully banned in this country since the 1970s. So I do feel that there's significant disinformation being spread, and equating hunting rifles that have been used for over a century in this country with weapons of war is straight up lying. And it's very insulting to insinuate that hunters in this country have weapons of war when they're perfectly legitimate tools that they've been using for well over a century, and much longer, in fact, particularly if you're talking about Indigenous hunters who've been hunting on this land for quite some time. So when we're reviewing this list, again, I'm not a firearms expert, though I would say that I know significantly more than Ms. Damoff about hunting. I have a lot of respect for hunters coming from a hunting family. For her to say which rifles are good for hunting when she has no knowledge of hunting whatsoever or respect for them, I find particularly offensive. So again, we are fielding hundreds of calls in the last number of days. The definition provided in this amendment casts a very, very, very wide and significant net. The most significant hunting rifle ban in the history of Canada is what's trying to be done here in the most underhanded way, Mr. Chair. If the Liberals had any integrity, they would have brought this forward in the original bill. Then it could have been debated in the House, but of course they did not do that. Then it could have been expert testimony brought forward during the witness testimony phase of this, but they did not do that. Why did they not do that? Did they not want to face proper public scrutiny? That's what it seems to be. So this isn't about safety. And again, Mr. Chair, this is coming in light of new statistics that show that under the Liberal government, there's been a 92% increase in gang-related homicides in this country. 92% increase since Prime Minister Trudeau took office. Also a 32% increase in violent crime, which equates to 124,000 more violent crimes last year than in 2015. That's things like rapes, assaults, stabbings, shootings. And we know that the firearm problem in this country, in large part, the vast majority of the issue, which is growing, which is of utmost concern, is the handguns that are being smuggled in illegally from the United States and being used by gangsters and gangs and criminals to hurt Canadians, particularly in our big major cities like Toronto and Montreal. Also, Winnipeg is experiencing this. So we have a real legitimate issue on our hands. We also know that they're 3D printing guns. We can't talk about it, but we know that in the debate in the days to come, there are various amendments that may address that. And we can have that debate when it happens. Unfortunately, we couldn't have that debate in the House. But I think the problem is we are seeing a government who's brought successive soft on crime policies. We can talk about bail reform from 2017 that contributed to the revolving door of criminals in and out of jail. That's coming home to roost now 5 years in. We can talk about Bill C-5 that they recently passed. They talk about gun crime, but they removed mandatory jail time for serious gun crimes. Like firing a gun with the intent to hit someone with the bullet is no longer a mandatory prison time. So they have no integrity when they come here and talk about wanting to keep Canadians safe from gun violence, when they are now allowing under Bill C-5 people who try to shoot other people. They may not have to go to jail. They could serve house arrest from the comforts of their homes. So it's very frustrating to be from a hunting community, a hunting background, and to care legitimately about solving the issue of violent crime involving illegally possessed firearms in this country, and to hear Liberals attacking hunters. And again, for 7 years, we heard this Liberal government, the Prime Minister, the Minister of Public Safety, members of this committee talk about this isn't about hunters. We've heard this today. And yet on this list, there are so many models of commonplace hunting rifles. Anything that's made by Remington, for example. Remington, Browning, Winchester, Benelli, those are firearm companies that specifically design hunting rifles. They cater to hunters. They don't cater to what she called weapons of war. A Winchester gun is a hunting rifle. Many of those are being banned. And what the backdoor of what this does as well, it permits all variants of those. So variants that aren't semi-automatic could also be easily added. So for hunters, which many hunters own, semi-automatic, again, that's a very common, legitimate hunting rifle model. Many of them also own non-semi-automatic ones that are from Winchester or Remington. So this allows a backdoor for hunters. As she said, we're just coming for your semi-automatics, which there's no buyback, by the way. No opportunity for them to be compensated for these very expensive hunting tools and farming tools. And so they're saying, oh, yeah, but we're just coming for some of them right now. But the backdoor is that they could come for all the variants as well. So I think the problem is that the government the Liberal Party has lost all ability to be trusted by hunters. First it was the OIC, and they said that we're not coming for hunters. Then it was the handgun freeze. Oh, who needs a handgun was their argument. But now it's legitimate hunting rifles. Again, you get a group of hunters together, probably about half of them have some form of semi-automatic hunting rifle. Again, very, very common. This is commonplace. To speak nothing for the heritage of many of these models. So I'll share with you an example. So my grandfather recently died, and he had a very difficult few last months in palliative care at home during the pandemic. And in his dying months, he came to us with one of his firearms that he had saved up for a very long time. He was a young man. It would have been in the 50s. And this firearm was probably his most prized possession. It looked like mint condition despite being 70 years old. And he bestowed it to my father. And so many Canadian families have that very same special cultural experience with being passed down an heirloom firearm, whether it be semi-automatic or not. Again, these are so commonplace. Millions of Canadian families will have had this experience with their grandfathers, with their uncles, with their fathers. These are family heirlooms as much as they are tools. And this government right now, with what they're doing so underhandedly with no integrity, they're coming to just say, you can't have that anymore, and we're not even going to pay you for it. No democratic debate with a sneaky amendment here at the end stage of committee, with no regard for what that does to Canadian culture. Again, hunting has been a part of this since long before the Europeans got here. And then firearms were introduced, and since then it's been a thriving part of the firearms hunting community in this country, both with Indigenous and non-Indigenous people. Again, as I mentioned, the SKS is a very popular hunting rifle in the Indigenous community, so I'm very interested to see what they think about this. So we have this experience that's completely being, I feel like it's being spat on, Mr. Chair. Well, too bad for you. We don't care that this is part of your cultural identity as Canadians. We don't care that this is part of the freedoms you enjoy. We're taking them from you, and you don't get a say in it. And in fact, we're building the legislation in a way that's so broad that we can take all of your hunting rifles. And as I've said, based on the commentary and the arguments they're making, you could apply that to any firearm. Any firearm. So they are now establishing an argument to ban every single lawfully owned firearm in this country. And I'd love to hear them actually deny that, because they have yet to do so. But it's very clear. They said they would never come for hunters, and now they have. So there is no more trust between anyone who has any sort of hunting background and what this Liberal government has done here. I actually was personally shocked. I actually was naive enough to believe that they wouldn't come for hunting rifles, but they are now. It's incredibly significant. There's even shotguns on there that are being, shotguns for hunting birds are being prohibited on here. And something that has been missing in this conversation, well, it really just started a couple days ago, because we haven't had a lot of time to talk about this. This bill's been on the floor for, 6 months? And now, we're learning what the real intentions are here. Something that hasn't been talked about is the raw utility of certain models of hunting rifles. I'm going to take Churchill, Manitoba, for example, the polar bear capital of the world. We know polar bears actively hunt human beings. They're extremely dangerous wildlife in Canada that we also have a lot of pride with, but they're very dangerous. The fact is, if you come across a polar bear or a cougar or an angry grizzly bear or a pack of wolves, for example, Mr. Chair, you better hope that you have a semi-automatic hunting rifle. It is your best defense against Canadian wildlife in this country that hunters come across often. Thankfully, they have tools to protect themselves and their families that they're hunting with. Thankfully, Indigenous communities have tools to protect themselves. Thankfully, Northern Indigenous communities have tools to protect themselves. But to say that these are weapons of war when they've been used as tools for hunting and protection against wild animals to protect livestock is disinformation, is straight up lies. It is discounting the utility of firearms in this country that has been around for centuries. We could also talk about wild boars, the very invasive and dangerous species that's spreading into southern Saskatchewan and Alberta. They breed very, very quickly, and they're very sneaky, and they can sneak up on you, and their tusks are deadly, and they're very fast. So if you are charged by a pack of wild boars, you better hope you have a semi-automatic hunting rifle with you. You better hope that you're able to defend your livestock and your farm dogs and your kids that are with you. Again, there is a utility factor in this that's being completely discounted. The argument could be made that banning these versions of hunting rifles also puts hunters, farmers, those who live in rural northern communities at risk. That should also be included. And we could have had that robust debate in the House with expert testimony had we been given the opportunity. But now we're having to do this in some filibuster because they're introducing this in an underhanded way. So I feel that if they were able to stand on their arguments, they would have welcomed this through the House and through witnesses, but they know what they're doing. This is hunting rifles now, hundreds of models of hunting rifles. And we see this often, and I find it to be, when we have a Liberal government in power, it seems to be, again, I've said this before, sort of looking down their nose at rural Canadians, at Eastern rural Canadians, at Northern Canadians, shaming them for the way they live, shaming them for generations of hunting heritage that we are proud of as the Conservative Party. Part of our Canadian identity is hunting. And so, but now we have a government that is looking to ban hundreds of models of perfectly legitimate hunting rifles. They're calling them weapons of war. These are not AK-47 fully automatic guns. And again, not a gun expert, but to call various Remingtons, Winchesters, Some models of 22s, I believe, are in here. Again, those are wild chicken hunting guns, Mr. Chair. To call those weapons of war is complete lies. And so, again, we are fielding a lot of calls from people, and this is men, this is women, this is families that build their entire recreational life, all of their culture around hunting, all of it. And now they're just going to lose, what, half their firearms? I think what Ms. Damoff said was that, well, you can use other ones. Well, who is she to say? She doesn't know anything about hunting. She doesn't respect us. I feel deeply disrespected by those comments. To say from someone who does not respect hunters or the deep hunting culture we have in this country, telling us what we need to hunt and to protect our livestock, to protect our families when we go for a walk in the Canadian wilderness, how could she possibly know what we need? It's very superior and condescending and paternalistic. And part of the problem that people get so fired up and don't trust this government, it's comments like that. How would they know what we need when they know nothing about how we live, Mr. Chair? So again, we have a lot of different perspectives that like to come forward. We have technical questions. I appreciate that we're now able to talk about the list. There are a lot of technical issues with that list, and I will return it over to my colleagues who are on the speaking list. But Mr. Chair, this is something I will just underline. This attack on hunters and the hunting community is completely unprecedented in Canadian history. This is you want to talk about war. This is a declaration of war on Canadian hunters from the Liberal government, and they're laughing. But that's how it feels. We feel that this is an all-out assault on how we live our lives, that they are taking something from us with no democratic debate, barely any oversight. We're having to filibuster just to get a word in edgewise about how this is going to impact people because we were not allowed that opportunity in the House of Commons. We were not allowed that opportunity with expert witnesses. They are attacking a centuries old heritage in this country. And they're scoffing and laughing as if it means nothing to them. Well, it means something to us, Mr. Chair. It means something to me. It means something to me on a very personal and deep level. And just trying to be very honest, this feels like a personal attack. And now, I'm not an avid sportsman, but I did grow up in a hunting family. All the people I grew up with had firearms. It was very common. And to see this kind of disrespect when we've done nothing wrong, when we have 92% increase in gang-related homicides, when we have that happening and they're coming for people like me, people like in my family, I think that speaks to misplaced priorities. And as I mentioned, there is no buyback in here. Unlike the OIC, and we have debated at length that issue, but unlike the OIC, they're not providing even a penny to these folks. It's just, they're banned, you can't use them anymore. Too bad for you. That's what we're looking at right now. And if they do come back and change their minds and decide it is a buyback, right now some of the estimates are showing from the OIC and the weapons ban will cost $5 billion. Easily that will be doubled by the hundreds of perfectly legitimate hunting rifles that will be banned in this. Easily. So we're talking probably about $10 billion, let's say, at least. Do you know how much good $10 billion could do if we actually targeted the problem, the 92% increase in gang-related homicides since Prime Minister Trudeau became the Prime Minister, the 32% increase in violent crime, notably focused in our urban cities, on our porous border that's letting gangsters and gang activity, criminal elements just smuggle handguns in and completely already prohibited weapons from the U.S. into our cities so they can use in their drug rings to hurt Canadians. Do you know how much $10 billion could do to stop that issue terrorizing our urban cities? I think quite a bit. $10 billion spent on hunters and people in rural Canada, it's not going to do a darn thing for that, Mr. Chair. The gang activity and the criminals that are smuggling in those prohibited weapons from the U.S. are laughing at this. They're laughing right along with the Liberals because it's not going to make one outcome of difference to their lives. It will do nothing to impact them, but it will do everything to impact rural Canada and the culture that we hold very, very dear to us. So this is just the beginning, Mr. Chair. Again, we're just learning about this. We're just trying to wrap our heads around the significance of it. But it is a fact that this is coming after hundreds of thousands of hunters who are trained, tested, and vetted, and just as legitimate as any Liberal member here, just as patriotic. They love this country and they love the freedoms that it's provided them. And so this is just the beginning of what we're doing. We will stand up for our hunting community, Mr. Chair. I will stand up for my family, for where I grew up. This is an all-out assault by the Liberals on the hunters in this country, and I look forward to the discussion we are about to have today and in the coming days, Mr. Chair. And I look forward to hearing from the millions of hunters in this community and their thoughts on this. Because as I'm hearing right now, the anxiety is extremely high, the upset is extremely high, the devastation of families is extremely high, and we're only a few days into this, Mr. Chair. So thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Dancho. So on my list, I have Mr. Lloyd and Mr. Motz, but I think I missed Mr. Fortin earlier. So if it's okay with you guys, I'll let recognize Mr. Fortin first, and then it would be Mr. Lloyd, Mr. Motz, and Mr. Nur Mohammed, and then Mr. Shipley. Okay? Monsieur Fortin, allez-y, s'il vous plaît.
Mr. Fortin, go ahead. Thank you, Mr. Chair. It's a pleasure to be able to speak today in committee. This is a very important committee. I'm replacing Christina Michaud, who is currently working abroad, so very happy to be here. For us in the Bloc Québécois, C-21 is a very important bill. I was able to speak multiple times, just like Ms. Michaud, on the importance of working effectively to prevent shootings like we've had in the last few months in Montreal, just like throughout Canada. And I think that there is a lot of work to do on illegal firearms. And we've spoken a lot of this often, and I will continue to criticize the Minister of Justice and of Public Safety for their laxism and their soft on crime approach. That being said, for C-21, we have asked multiple times, and it also is a part of our platform as the Bloc Québécois, for a clear definition on which firearms will be banned, because it's somewhat impossible to find the clear definition of what is planned, because we don't want people to not understand what is and isn't legal. So all this to say that for G4, I have the impression that it's the Bloc Québécois that wrote it. But of course, that's not the case. It's from the government. But it does meet our expectations. Now, is it sufficient as a definition? You know, we always support listening to the opinion of experts. But with the Conservatives, I share this concern on clear meaningful description of which firearms should be banned. We need, though, to ban them, and we need to put an end to this proliferation of firearms in Quebec and in Canada. This has dramatic consequences for many of our citizens. And so I just wanted to state that, Mr. Chair, the Bloc Québécois will be voting in favor of the G4 amendment, and we support all measures that aim to put an end to these horrible shootings and the unfortunate abusive uses of firearms in Quebec and Canada. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Merci, monsieur.
Thank you, sir.
Mr. Lloyd or Mr. Motz, you guys can sort it out. I don't know which is which order is which. Mr. Lloyd, and then we will have Mr. Nur Mohammed, followed by Mr. Shipley. Mr. Lloyd, go ahead, please.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the witnesses for coming. I will have some technical questions for you, like I did yesterday. But yeah, following up on my colleague, Ms. Dancho's initial statement, I really feel like a red line has been crossed in this country with this amendment. In this country, we don't have a Second Amendment, and I think that is appropriate. But what we do have is a social contract that has existed for decades, for generations in this country. And that is a social contract between the Government of Canada and society, and part of that society including law-abiding firearms owners. And for generations, Canadians have accepted that regulation is an important part of cultivating a responsible firearms culture in this country, a very important firearms safety culture. And over the generations, in response to exceptional instances, horrible tragedies in many cases, governments have seen fit, governments of all political persuasions have seen fit to put forward amendments and legislation to close gaps, to try to prevent tragedies from happening. But whenever those laws were passed, there was always an understanding that there was no intention to target law-abiding firearms owners, hunters, farmers, sport shooters, gun collectors, and there was always a great deal of deference put into the legislative drafting, into having witnesses come, into creating legislation that ensured that that social contract with firearms owners, with Indigenous people, with hunters, was preserved and protected. And I think, one great example of that, and this is going to be a technical question I'll ask, so I'll just kind of put it on your radar, is Section 117.15 of the Criminal Code. And Section 117.15 of the Criminal Code gives the Governor and Council the ability to regulate firearms. But there is a subsection of that, and this was passed in 1995. So this isn't a recent law. This is a law that's nearly 30 years old. In making regulations, so quote, in making regulations, the Governor and Council may not prescribe anything to be a prohibited firearm, a restricted firearm, a prohibited weapon, a restricted weapon, a prohibited device, or prohibited ammunition, if, in the opinion of the Governor and Council, the thing to be prescribed is reasonable for use in Canada for hunting or sporting purposes. So this is the law of the land in this country. It hasn't been changed since 1995, that when the Governor and Council is in the process of changing the classification of a firearm to be a restricted or a prohibited firearm, they must consider whether that firearm could be reasonably used for a hunting or sporting purpose. And I am concerned, and I will ask this as a direct question to the witnesses, is how does this amendment, G4 today, how does it interact with that provision of the criminal code? Because I think that's a very important question that we have to answer today. Because, as I said, a red line has been crossed. As much as, I appreciate the opening statement from my Liberal colleague that said that it was not their intention to target hunters in any way, there are a number of shotguns and rifles that have been explicitly named in Amendment G46 that I think any reasonable person would see to be a hunting or sporting firearm. And I think that's quite apparent. And so, for this government to put forward this amendment without any thought to the law of the land really draws a lot of concern for me. And these hunting and sporting rifles, the Benelli M3 was one of them. It's a wooden stock. It doesn't have a detachable magazine, which is interesting because sub-amendment G of this amendment, which we talked about Tuesday as the evergreen definition, cites that any semi-automatic rifle or shotgun with a detachable magazine that has the capacity to carry more than 5 rounds. Now, in Canada, it's been long accepted, this is part of the social contract that I talked about, that we do not want to have high-capacity magazines in Canada. And so there has always been a limit on centerfire ammunition that you cannot have a magazine that exceeds 5 rounds. Well, in Canada, we don't really have a huge firearms industry. Most hunting and sporting rifles and shotguns are manufactured in other countries, and other countries don't have this 5-round magazine rule. So any of these firearms, that are being banned, even though in Canada you are not allowed to have a magazine that exceeds 5 rounds, they were all originally designed, for the most part, as far as I know, to potentially carry 6 or 7 or even more rounds. And in Canada, we currently have a ban. It's a criminal offense to have a prohibited magazine. It's a prohibited magazine if it carries more than 5 rounds. And I think that has been a largely effective policy. It has been a policy that has been accepted in this country for many, many years. And so we can use these rifles that could potentially carry more rounds, but no law-abiding person, they would immediately cease to be law-abiding. No hunter would want to use any magazine that had a capacity of higher than 5 rounds. But now the government is saying they're going to approach this from the other end and say, we're not just going to ban magazines that can carry more than 5 rounds. We're going to carry any gun that could carry a magazine that has more than 5 rounds. And in the process of adding that amendment, they are capturing an immense amount of firearms, many of which are used for hunting and sporting purposes. And so this is what I say, a red line has been crossed. Are they banning all hunting and sporting shotguns and rifles? Certainly they're not. But that's exactly how this starts. The government, this Liberal government, will take incremental steps forward, and I would submit that this is not an incremental step. This is a massive step. It's a step that was not talked about in the last federal election or in the last number of federal elections in specific terms. The government has, used very ambiguous terms, such as military-style assault weapon, and you know what, I actually agree somewhat with my Bloc colleague who said, we all want a definition. We want a strong definition. But at no time has there been a consultation with the public. Was there an election platform that stated that the definition of what an assault weapon is or a military-style assault weapon would be semi-automatic center-fire shotguns and rifles? And that was never anything that was contemplated. That was not something that we talked about in this committee. It was not something in the original Bill C-21. It's not something that we knew about, so we didn't know to ask witnesses about it. We didn't bring specific witnesses about it. And so in a way, although this bill has, a number of steps in the democratic process to go before it potentially passes into law, the addition of this amendment at this stage does, impugn our democracy, because it has removed our ability at the second reading, which took place, the second reading debate, the second reading vote, and through the committee stage in the House of Commons, it has precluded our ability to bring in witnesses, to bring in experts, to talk about this issue and debate this issue. It's just been table dropped as an amendment after we had completed our vigorous study on this, a study that I would submit did not go very well for the government. I think this C-21 legislation was very poorly drafted. It was very, it was not well thought out. A number of the well-intentioned things that the government put in it were later found to have been extremely flawed. Witnesses from across the political spectrum noted that these things were flawed. I won't get into those specifics, but it became increasingly clear as we got to the end of the process that this bill would have to be amended significantly, and for the government to recognize that these significant amendments were likely coming, they chose to table drop these massive new amendments that, in the words of one person, one lawyer said, is the most significant revision to the Firearms Act since the Firearms Act was passed in 1995. The most significant revisions to the Firearms Act in the history of the Firearms Act, and it's not even being debated as its own standalone motion. It's being debated as an amendment at the clause-by-clause stage at committee. Like, this is not how our democracy is supposed to work. Yes, if this bill makes it to the Senate, there will be an opportunity for senators to look into this, but, the Liberal government, because of this Trojan horse last-minute maneuver, has precluded my right as a parliamentarian, my privilege as a member of Parliament, a member of the House of Commons, to study this bill and to debate it on its merits. I'm stuck here at the clause-by-clause stage when the train is already leaving the station, and trying to get answers about what this is going to do. And so I think that raises some very serious implications for the legitimacy and the credibility of this legislation, the credibility of this amendment. I understand, some colleagues will say that they want to, some in other parties, they want to vote for this, but I think surely they could recognize that it is a very bad precedent to set to allow any party or any government to add an amendment that was not conceived of in the original legislation, that was not discussed at all in the witness testimony, that was not brought forward at this late stage in the process. So moving on from that, getting back to the social contract, Canada is not the United States of America, and I think that is a great thing. My family left this country, left the United States, well, the 13 colonies, in 1783. We fled from upstate New York together with our brothers and sisters in the Six Nations, the Mohawk Nations. We left the Mohawk Valley of upstate New York to move to the Belleville region of Ontario. We were United Empire Loyalists, and we came to this country because we rejected the political ideology of the American Revolution. We're friends with the Americans. They're our allies. We share many common values, but Canada was founded, one of the founding peoples of this nation, the Loyalists, who came from the 13 colonies as refugees to this country with the Indigenous peoples in upstate New York and other places, and with the members of the Francophone, the Quebec Nation, who also, there was entreaties from the United States to ask the Quebec Nation to join in the revolution, and they rejected the revolution. So this country was founded as a rejection of the revolution. And I think that that is a great thing, because I am a Canadian patriot. I believe in this country. I believe in the reasons that this country was founded. And I believe that we are a distinct society. We are distinct from the United States. And that's why it actually offended me. I do respect my colleague, Mr. Chang, and his service in the police service, but it did offend me as a Canadian when he moved this amendment to cite a California law that we need to be implementing California American-style laws in this country. I don't have these statistics in front of me, but I can bet that the murder rate in the state of California by firearms is far greater than the murder rate in this country, and that's something I'm very proud of in this country, is that we're a safer country, by no means a perfect country, but we are a country that has better firearms laws than any state in the United States. And for this Liberal member to come forward and cite an American law in the American context as a reason to pass a new law into Canada, I think that's wrong, because we are Canadians. We have our own way. We are distinct. We do not need American-style laws in this country. We do not need American divisive political rhetoric in this country. And you know what? I think, frankly, it does. I'm a big fan of George Grant and his work, Lament for a Nation. And we have seen, and in his book, one of the thesis is that the Liberal Party of Canada has always found political power by importing American cultural debates into this country. And they are breaking the social contract. This has eroded the social contract in this country. And I'm going to say why this is super dangerous for our country, why the social contract has been broken, the result of this social contract being broken, why it's so dangerous. But first off, why is this Liberal government breaking the social contract with hunters and law-abiding gun owners? Is it because of public safety? Well, no, because we've seen from the witnesses, from police, from people that are working in our inner cities, that these firearms are, and we're talking about handguns, we're talking about fully automatic firearms, which are heavily restricted or illegal in this country, are being smuggled in from the United States, a country with far different gun laws than we have, and they are being used to commit crimes on our streets. These are not law-abiding hunters and sport shooters. They're not using many of the firearms that the government's listed in G46, like a Benelli M3 shotgun. It wouldn't be used by people who are committing crimes on our streets. And so for the government to list that is a clear violation of our social contract. And why they are doing that is because they have recognized that this is a divisive political issue that they can use to divide Canadians between rural Canadians and urban Canadians, between Canadians who own firearms and Canadians who don't know much about firearms, don't own firearms, and are afraid of firearms. They've recognized this as a way to divide Canadians for their own political success. And I think that's wrong, because we are eroding something that is very fundamental about our country. Something that is very fundamental to our identity as Canadians is that we have this social contract where firearms owners do not have explicit rights written into the Constitution of this country, but that this country respects the rights of law-abiding firearms owners who follow the law, who go through the process, who get vetted by the Canadian Firearms Program, by the RCMP, who can have their guns taken at any time by the police, even without a warrant. If anyone calls into a police station with a claim that somebody is a threat to themselves or to others, the police have the power to act. That's something that doesn't exist in the United States. but it exists in Canada. And I think that's a positive thing. Because as somebody who comes from a family of gun owners, we never had to be worried that our government was going to pass legislation that discriminated against us, because we knew that as long as we followed all these rules, reasonable rules that have been accepted for generations and decades in this country, that we would be respected by our government. And it is only under this Liberal government that social contract has been violated, and not for public safety reasons, which I think, we could look into, but for purely political division reasons, purely for their own political gain. And I think that's that's a shame on the Liberal Party of Canada. And I know they have lots of members who live in rural areas, who probably own firearms themselves, who are probably concerned about this legislation. I don't know how much consultation they probably did within their own caucus on this. I won't speculate on that. I don't know. But I just think it's just so shocking to me that they would cross this red line, and that they would delve into an area about shotguns and rifles. And so, moving on, I see that the government, and actually it was one of my questions, when I first saw this list of guns, the 310 pages or so, and G46 come out, I was just really curious, why is the government putting this list as an amendment to C-21? And in looking at the list of guns, it quickly became apparent that a lot of these guns had just been copy and pasted from the May 2020 order in council. But we have since discovered that there is somewhat, based on testimony yesterday, between 300 to 400 additional firearms that have been added onto the May 2020 list. And so I thought, well, why would this Liberal government need to pass this as an amendment? If these firearms are a threat to public safety, they could have the authority. And I guess I'll see it in my quick question. Does the government have the authority to add these firearms to the banned list using an OIC immediately? That's my question.
I'll start from first principles, which is that the government has the ability to prohibit firearms through two means. The first means is through the power of prescription, which is set out in Section 117.15, and also set out in the definition of prohibited firearms. And as you mentioned, and then the second way is through legislation, which is what is being proposed here today. You mentioned earlier, and I will proactively respond to your question about the limitation on the Governor and Council when prescribing a firearm by order in Council, that the Governor and Council must be of the view that the firearm is not reasonable for hunting and sporting purposes. Going back to the May 1st OIC, the regulatory impact analysis statement stated throughout it a number of times that the Governor and Council was of the view that these firearms posed too great of a public safety risk in order to be to not be prohibited, to remain non-restricted or restricted. So going back to your original question, yes, the government could prohibit the additional 400, I don't have the exact number, but the additional firearms that are listed by regulation. But what is being proposed is those firearms be prohibited here today through motions that would amend legislation.
But it would be more immediate for them to do it through an OIC. Would you agree that it would be a faster process to do it through an OIC?
It would be
through legislation?
It would be a faster process, but what's being proposed is that the process be part of the legislative process before Parliament.
I appreciate that. So that question tells me that there is no urgent public safety need to ban these firearms, because these additional 400, because the government has not banned them through an OIC. And so they're willing to wait weeks and months, depending on how long this legislation passes, to let these firearms be added to the legislation. So that indicates to me that it's not because of any urgent public safety measure. What are the other, if you can say, what are the other, I know, and Ms. Demoff stated that the reason they wanted to add this to the legislation was to prevent a future government, and I think a conservative government, they said, from repealing it using an order in council. It is their intention to add this to legislation so that a future government would have to explicitly pass legislation to repeal it. That is your understanding, is that correct?
That's correct. Any amendment to the definition of prohibited firearm that is set out in the criminal code would have to be amended in the future through the parliamentary process.
Now, are there any court cases ongoing right now that this would have an impact on?
To any ongoing litigation.
Okay. It's just interesting to me that you mentioned a regulatory impact statement that the government used to say that these firearms were too dangerous, so they were not considered reasonable for a hunting and sporting purpose. Is that a public regulatory statement?
Yes, it is. It's attached to the regulations that were published on May 1st, 2020.
And is there information in that, and maybe you could send that to the committee, I'd appreciate that if you could. Sure. But is there anything in that regulatory impact statement that says, like, the government, did they just come out and say it is our opinion that these are too dangerous? But was there any consultation done? Was there any evidence that they provided to back up their assertion that these firearms were too dangerous?
So as my colleague mentioned yesterday, or 2 days ago? Yesterday, that 2 days ago, that the government did undertake consultations in 2018. They were broadly based consultations, and there's a report that's published that sets
I'm aware of that.
Okay.
I read it yesterday. Thank you after you noted that to me.
Okay, so
I would note in that legislation that there was never any direct consultations on semi-automatic rifles and shotguns, though.
okay.
Are you aware? Am I wrong? Was there ever? I saw there was a survey where they asked a number of questions. Was there any questions about whether or not the government should ban semi-automatic rifles or shotguns?
So that is actually a question that I will defer to my colleague at Public Safety.
So thank you for the question. So with regards to what was consulted on in 2018 and what made the basis of that regulatory impact analysis statement, I would refer you to that regulatory impact analysis statement.
I am having trouble hearing you. I did have my,
I'm sorry. Can you hear me now?
maybe my thing isn't working, but I sort of, you were faint, but you were referring me to the regulatory impact statement. But are you aware of the government's consultation that took place, I believe, in 2019? You're aware of that consultation?
I am
Are you aware of the contents of that consultation?
Broadly.
Broadly. Now, are you aware, can you confirm or deny whether or not the government asked those that they consulted whether they supported a ban on semi-automatic shotguns and rifles in that consultation?
So I cannot. I am here to provide information and information with regards to the motions that have been put forward in terms of the effect of those.
Okay. Thank you. Are you aware that one of the survey questions, and I think it was a kind of a very leading question, because we don't have a definition of what an assault weapon is, but that one of the survey questions were, does more action need to be taken to ban assault weapons in this country? And are you aware that 77% of respondents to the government's consultation said that they thought that we had enough regulations or did not need more regulations for so-called assault weapons in this country? Are you aware of that statistic in that consultation?
Thank you for your question. I think that's a question that I think I would invite you to pose to the minister.
Yeah, I know, it's I'm having a problem as well.
Sorry, can you hear me now? Okay, thank you. Thank you for your question. That is a question I would invite you to pose to the minister.
Yes, it seems like we have about as much luck getting answers from the minister as we seem to be having today, but I thank you for your efforts to do that. A lot of concerns I have here is like maybe getting down into how this, the consequences of this legislation, should this amendment pass. Will anyone who owns these firearms, how will the process work? Because will they be immediately committing a criminal act for possession of these firearms?
No, the proposed amendments to the definition of prohibited firearm would not come into force on royal assent. They would come into force by order in council, which means they would come into force at a later date.
And is there a prescribed number of days that that order in council has to come into effect?
There's not.
So it's sort of like a sword of Damocles for firearms owners once this passes, that, basically the government doesn't need to regulate these things right away, but the government could be holding it over their heads at any time, and at any time they could decide, it could be 30 days after this passes, it could be 2 years after this passes, but it's something that, they can hold over their heads for as long as possible. Perhaps something they could hold over as something to bring up during an election, perhaps, but I would never want to accuse them of that. But it would also demonstrate that, perhaps this is less about public safety and more about politics. If this order in council, when the order in council is triggered, what would be the effect of that triggering? Or is that something that has still to be determined by the regulations?
Future steps with respect to how the newly prohibited firearms would be treated has not been determined at this point. I would remind you, though, when the May 1st OIC came into effect, there was an amnesty order, and that gave lawful owners an opportunity to either dispose of their firearms or otherwise come into compliance with the new law. So they have a period of time during which they are not subject to criminal liability for unlawful possession, and then a decision would be made by the government as to how to move forward with the treatment of any newly prohibited firearms that would be included in this amended definition.
So what you're saying, without repeating everything you're saying, is that the precedent that this government has set that is being implemented is that there is an amnesty period following the May 2020, but you can't say for sure whether that is going to be what follows this one.
So what I was saying is that for the May 1st, 2020 OIC, an amnesty order was included the moment that the firearms became prohibited. So firearms owners were not exposed to criminal liability. There was an amnesty order in place. I cannot comment as to what would happen if there is an order in council that brings these provisions into force, but I can refer you back to what the government has done historically.
Thank you. I do appreciate that.
Okay.
I'm not trying to put words in your mouth. I'm just trying to understand what you're saying. There has been some concern that because the May 2020 OIC was passed via an OIC, that it is subject to the laws of Parliament, like that it is, that it is below a law of Parliament, whereas an act of Parliament, which is what this proposed amendment would be doing, puts it sort of on equal step with other parliamentary laws. Now, if the government sets the precedent that they're going to ban these firearms in legislation, does that preclude their need to provide a statement, as I mentioned in 117, that they believe that this is not reasonable for use in hunting? Do they no longer need to provide that justification if they pass this through legislation?
The justification that you're referring to applies to firearms that are prohibited by regulation. So that's a limitation on the Governor and Council's ability to exercise their discretion to determine whether or not a specific firearm should be prohibited. The democratic process is what would be used to debate whether or not these firearms should be prohibited through legislation.
Yes, and so I guess I just want to confirm what you're saying is that the Governor and Council rule does not bind the government if they pass this legislation from providing a justification about why these hunting rifles should be banned.
So
that's a protection that exists only for the Governor and Council regulations, but not for legislation through Parliament. Is that correct?
the ability of the Governor and Council to prescribe firearms is a delegated power that comes from Parliament.
Of course.
And when this provision was enacted, Parliament imposed a limitation on the Governor and Council as to what firearms could be prohibited.
And now the government is saying we don't want that limitation anymore because, as we have said, they want the power to ban hunting rifles. And so that's why they're circumventing this very reasonable limitation, I think, that existed in the 1995 firearms law. And, you know, I think that just proves further evidence points that this is really about giving the government the power to move forward and limit all sorts of new hunting firearms. They're just going to do this through a legislative process. instead of through a governor and council, where at least they would be held accountable and have to justify why these hunting rifles could not be allowed. So another follow-up is that the Bill of Rights, the 1960 Bill of Rights, is still a law of this land. I mean, we have a Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which is very important. But the Bill of Rights says very explicitly that Canadians have the right to life, liberty, security of the person, and also the right to enjoyment of property that cannot be deprived except with due process of law. And so if the government, under the governor and council, are they bound by the Bill of Rights when they come up with policies to confiscate firearms? Are they bound by the due process of law in the Canadian Bill of Rights when depriving people of the enjoyment of their property?
Sorry, my earphone's not working, but what I can say is that the Supreme Court ruled in, I think it was 1991 or 1992, in the firearms the firearms reference case, that there is no right in Canada to possess firearms.
I don't disagree with you. But in terms of property, if you are given the right to own a firearm as property, firearms are property as well, the government can't just seize that property except through due process of law. Would you say that is correct?
So I think one of the questions is with respect to the federal criminal power, and the reference re firearms decision by the Supreme Court of Canada determined that firearms and the regulation of firearms falls within the criminal law power versus the provincial power over property. And it also indicated that there was no right to firearms in Canada.
But this is the Bill of Rights. This is a federal law, not a provincial law. Are you aware of the Bill of Rights? Is it still in force in Canada? Like it still has power in this country, the Bill of Rights?
Yes. Yes, it does.
And so what I'm getting at here is that it seems like the government, is trying to, through the buyback program and the May 2020 OIC, trying to respect the Bill of Rights and say, we're going to confiscate your property, which is a violation of the Bill of Rights, but we're going to make it up to you because we're going to compensate you for that property. It happens all the time in this country, eminent domain laws, when people have their property seized to build a highway. The government has to compensate you for that. That's the due process of law. But if the government passes this amendment that we're talking about today, G4, and it's not, is it notwithstanding the Bill of Rights? Because is that something that the government's saying, that this will be notwithstanding the Bill of Rights protections for property rights?
So the criminal law falls under the criminal law power that is under the federal jurisdiction. And that's what I can point to when we speak about criminal law and this legislation that is being amended through the bill and the motions. It is under the federal criminal law power.
Yes, I understand that. I guess what I'm trying to say is that because this will be an act of parliament and not a regulation, as we've already cleared up, this bill will be on an equal playing field with the Bill of Rights, and therefore will not necessarily be subject to the Bill of Rights protections on property right. And so what I'm submitting, that the reason for another additional reason why the government is submitting this through legislation is not only, as they said, to prevent any future government from repealing these OICs, they would have to repeal it through legislation, but they're doing it to relieve the government of any responsibility to compensate people for their firearms. And that's something, that's something that I think is very worrisome because, as I'm going to get here on my next line of questions, it's very clear from a Conference Board of Canada report that the hunting and trapping and sport shooting sectors were responsible for upward of $13.2 billion of GDP in this country in 2018. And that represents about 0.6% of Canada's GDP at the time. That is an extremely significant amount of GDP. Now, I know a lot of these hunters and sport shooters, it's a tourism industry. A lot of these people come in from the United States. Can you tell us how this amendment would impact Americans who want to bring, let's say if the Americans were bringing a firearm that was listed under this amendment, would they be able to bring that firearm up? Do they get an exemption? Because obviously they don't need to have a Canadian firearms license to come up here as a tourist to shoot. So would they be required to not bring any firearms that would be covered under this amendment when they come here to sport shoot?
Thank you for the question. In terms of the if the motion and the bill passes and it receives royal assent, the same rules that apply today in terms of if you're bringing in a non-restricted, in terms of the processes and procedures, the same thing for restricted, and I believe for prohibited firearms, you cannot bring them into the country. You would have to use another, an American, for example, that would be coming in to hunt, would need to bring in a firearm that was, that they could legally bring into Canada.
So so what you're saying is that if this legislation and this amendment passes, that a number of these new firearms, if like a tourist was coming to this country to spend tens of thousands of dollars to hunt big game, if they only had these prohibited firearms, they would not be allowed to bring those prohibited firearms into this country. They would have to find a non-restricted firearm to bring into this country. Is that what you're saying?
They would have to bring one in that they can bring in, or they would have to make arrangements to use another firearm.
To use a non-restricted firearm, a non-prohibited firearm, is that correct?
They would have to use whatever they can that is legally allowed here in Canada.
Interesting. Yeah, very concerning because, if the definition that we're bringing here is any semi-automatic rifle or shotgun that is capable of carrying a magazine over 5 rounds, I know a lot of tourists that come to this country to spend tens of thousands of dollars on one trip alone, they wouldn't be able to bring their firearms. And so they would just choose not to come to this country in the first place. Has there been any economic analysis done by the government on the impact on tourism, like the sports and hunting tourism, that this amendment would have an impact on?
Thank you. I don't believe that there has been.
Okay, thank you. So the government hasn't even done an economic analysis on the impact of this sweeping new legislation. And that's just talking about tourists. I mean, let's talk about, the Canadians, like over 1 million, 1.3 million Canadian hunters in this country who contribute to our GDP and who, are tax-paying citizens who abide by the law and generate this generates economic activity in our country. And we're talking about upwards of $13.2 billion. And I believe that this legislation could take a significant chunk of that out of our country. And the government hasn't even provided an economic analysis. And it just speaks to the fact that this has come, very late in the committee process. We could have had witnesses. We could have asked the minister questions. We could have had people bring economic analyses so that we could have studied this. But unfortunately, we haven't. With that, Mr. Chair, I think I'm going to cede my time to my colleague, Mr. Motz. I know, Mr. Chair, you found it very riveting, what I've had to say, and very educational as well. And so I thank you for giving me this time to speak to the committee. Thank you.
Indeed, I found it intensely riveting and fascinating. So Mr. Motz is recognized.
Thank you very much, Chair. And I'm going to start by going back to the opening statement that was made by Ms. Damoff. For Canadians who are watching online right now or who will watch this at some point later down the road, I want you to go back to the very beginning of this particular meeting. And I want you to listen to the comments that were made by Ms. Damoff. With all due respect to Ms. Damoff, the statement that was obviously prepared for her just identifies the...
Point of order, Chair. I wrote every single word on there.
Then that applies to you then.
Mr. Moff, on a point of order?
Yes, I wrote every single word in what I said. For someone to imply that I didn't, I take great offense to.
Perfect.
Thank
Then
you
see,
for
where's
that,
the comments I'm about to make then? So the fact that the statements that were made by, now admittedly by Ms. Damoff, suggest the absolute and utter ignorance to the laws that we have in this country already, to the whole historical perspective of firearms, the use of firearms for hunting. It absolutely makes zero sense and identifies again the lack of understanding that this member has, and the Liberals for that matter, because they're the ones who are pushing this misguided legislation, have even on the firearms that are used for military applications. And so it flies in the face of common sense. I can't imagine the emails that we're going to get now based on that statement. and how people are so frustrated with this government already and their misguided approach. But I want to go back to the reason why we're debating this particular issue. And for those of you who may not be aware or need to be reminded, we are dealing with a government amendment. It's called G4 in our package. It's a government amendment to a bill. So they wrote the bill and obviously found out that there's a lot of mistakes with the bill. And so they decided to add some things to it that they didn't want to have covered off at the front end. And that would be my perspective, is that when a bill is presented, it is able to be debated in the House before it comes to committee. So before this bill even came to committee, we had opportunity to debate the substance of the bill. Now, this amendment, for example, and I'll get to it in just a minute, was not able to be debated. It was not even included in the bill. No one knew it was even coming. However, I believe the Liberals knew exactly what they were doing. This was not a backdoor process. It certainly is a backdoor process, but it was done deliberately, in my estimation. And so I have an initial question to those from the officials that are here. So you were involved in creating Bill C-21, is that correct?
That's correct.
So in your initial creation of Bill C-21, was there any conversations about this particular amendment in those initial conversations?
I would suggest to Mr. Motz that he's asking for probably confidential privileged information, so.
No, they don't have privilege on that matter. They can answer the question, Chair, directly on whether or not, when they were asked for information, when they started preparing these amendments.
Well, I believe the development of legislation at the cabinet level is subject to cabinet competence. So anyway, I'll certainly allow the witnesses to respond if they wish.
So
Yeah, I like on Tuesday, I believe the chair has a misinterpretation of what is and isn't allowed. And I'll ask it a different way then. So when you prepared the C-21, the original version that came before Parliament, did you have in the background amendment G46 and G4, for example, that would expand the definition of a prohibited firearm? Was that something that you were already working on then?
I can't answer that question. That falls within solicitor-client privilege. I can answer any question related to the bill as presented in Parliament and any question related to the motions.
Yeah. And again, like I told you before, with all due respect, this, if I'm pushing, it's not going to be on you, it's going to be about the government, all right? And you need to understand that. So I always find it, like another committee I sit on, that when things get a little too hot, the government likes to hide behind this privilege that they've identified, and it's rather interesting. So for, you know, and I guess I can come to my own conclusions. The Canadian public certainly will come to their own conclusions on when this actually, the thought of, well, you know what, let's not put it in right away, because if we put it in right away, we're going to have a huge debate on our hands. The Canadian public is going to be up in arms, pardon the pun, about the use of expanding expanding the definition of prohibited firearm to include hunting rifles and shotguns that are right now, before this passes, a non-restricted firearm in this country. And I think it was a deliberate attempt to mislead the Canadian public and mislead Parliament, and this was being planned. But anyway, for the public at home to see what we're talking about and why this is so disconcerting, is in G4, which is a government amendment number 4, one of the things they're adding there is that they want to change the definition in section 84(1) of the Criminal Code to expand the definition of a prohibited firearm. And they want to expand and add to the definition to include, and I quote, a firearm that is a rifle or shotgun that is capable of discharging a centerfire ammunition in a semi-automatic manner, and that is designed to accept a detachable cartridge magazine with a capacity greater than 5 cartridges of a type for which the firearm was originally design. In effect, this now 11th hour backdoor change to the definition of a prohibited firearm will render hundreds of thousands of firearms that are currently in circulation in this country, legally acquired, and many of them non-restricted, to now be not restricted, but completely prohibited. So, on a personal note, my children, my grandchildren hunt. Their father has passed on some incredible legacy to them from his father about hunting. They got and they hunt for food. They don't have regular beef in their fridge. They have antelope and deer and elk and moose and bear and everything else that they can hunt. They hunt. And it's a great legacy. I'm so proud of what my grandchildren are doing and how my grandson, or my son-in-law, is teaching them these skills. This year they got an antelope and a moose, and they have other animals that they are seeking to fill up their fridges. The firearms they use, legally acquired, legally possessed, are now going to be prohibited. Why? What, and the suggestion earlier was that, we have these, these firearms that exist, that they have on this list now. They are, strangely, they are military, a military firearm that is used for that. Well, so you know what? I asked my grandson recently. He has a semi-automatic rifle, and why do you have a semi-automatic? Well, Papa, it's in case I care about my animals. I don't want them to suffer. And if I take an animal and he doesn't go down right away, I need to have access to make sure I can take him down in a humane way. For a 14-year-old little boy, I find that to be pretty remarkable. And it just shows again the absolute and utter ignorance of this government, members of this government, this whole process of trying to identify these big bad people who are the Canadian firearm owners, who are somehow a risk to the Canadian public, to have firearms that have been, in some cases, passed down for generations, to have them now all of a sudden be illegal. I find that to be incredibly problematic, and is just an example again how ideology trumps common sense. And again, this is not directed at you folks. I want to pick up on a comment that my colleague Mr. Dane spoke about with respect to the Canadian Bill of Rights in 1960. And Section 1 there says, "It is hereby recognized and declared that in Canada there have existed and shall continue to exist without discrimination by reason of race, national origin, color, religion, or sex, the following human rights and fundamental freedoms, namely, the right of the individual to life, liberty, security of the person, and enjoyment of property, and the right not to be derived thereof except by due process of law." And that's the key. Because as I understand this, what will happen is the fact that this deceptive Liberal government intends to try to push this through, it means that they don't have to then compensate anyone if they make all these firearms illegal, because that's the due process of law in this country. Would that be a fair assessment? That by listing them as a prohibited firearm, what originally was a non-restricted firearm is now prohibited, that would mean that the government could take that property because that follows the due process of law. Would that be a correct assumption?
So the government can bring before Parliament a bill that can prohibit within the federal sphere of jurisdiction, and compensation is a matter of policy and whether or not to compensate
Right,
owners.
and I appreciate that, but what I guess, let me ask it a different way. What I'm trying to ask is, so the government will do this under the guise of public safety, they're going to do this under the guise of due process. They're going to pass legislation, it's going to be forced through without proper debate in the House that should have and could have occurred. They are going to have support, I'm sure, from other opposition parties, and therefore it becomes law. And then, because it becomes law, that property, which was 5 minutes previous to it becoming law, was able to be lawfully enjoyed in a non-restricted manner, now becomes prohibited. So then they can seize that property. That property is able to be seized then by the government because it is no longer lawful, and it is then seizable, if you will, because it was done through due process of law. Would that, am I correct in assuming that?
Due process of law includes the parliamentary process by which Parliament decides what firearms may or may not be prohibited. Whether or not the government chooses or decides to compensate owners in the future.
Yeah, I don't want to get stuck on compensation because it's a red herring, right? Because all I'm trying to get at is that contrary to the Bill of Rights, the way for the government to get around the Bill of Rights is to make what was previously legal to possess, legal to own, was lawfully purchased by millions of Canadians in this country. And many of the firearms listed here, hundreds and hundreds of them are non-restricted. They're using this due process of law to actually prohibit a firearm, and that's how they're getting around the whole process about forcing people to lose their property. Would that be a correct assessment?
So if you're asking what is the impact of the legislation, the impact of the legislation is once it comes into force, these items would be prohibited and would no longer be legal to possess or use.
Okay, that's fair, and I get it coming into force, but my point really is, and I'm going to keep on it for a bit, is that, and make the suggestion that the government is using the due process of law to otherwise take and cause Canadians' lawfully obtained property to become illegal, and they're using that avenue as a way to circumvent the human rights. Would that the Canadian Bill of Human Rights? Would that be a fair assessment?
So I think as we've already answered, I mean, the Canadian Bill of Rights applies to federal legislation, and once federal legislation has been passed that authorizes or permits that property rights are subsumed by the federal legislation, then following that passage of legislation, which could or would prohibit future firearms, anything that follows that is done as a policy decision made by the government.
I understand.
And I don't think we have, there's nothing else that we can add to your question.
Right, so I won't ask the question, I'll just make the statement. Okay, so the government of Canada has circumvented the Canadian Bill of Rights on property, lawfully obtained property, by making that lawfully obtained property now prohibited and unlawful. That would be the fair way of saying it. So let me ask you again a previous question about G4 and G46. On what date did you start working on G4?
So that particular question, we would not be able to answer because it's subject to solicitor-client privilege. But what I can say is that the original bill that was tabled in 2019 did not have these amendments in it. And the next thing I can say is that there were public commitments to ban further assault-style firearms by the government following Bill C-21, and I believe on the introduction of the second or the reintroduction of Bill C-21. So that is what I can advise committee members in terms of conversations and public statements that have been made by the government.
Okay. So you made a very interesting statement. the government now had conversations about banning additional assault-style rifles. I mean, we all can show pictures of the list here, and they're not, I mean, the definition, like what is a military style, you know, a military assault style rifle? I mean, I know that's going to be coming up in some magic definition that's coming up forward, but it's never been identified. And so what I find interesting is the fact that, you know, as legislators, or as legislation writers, you were asked to find firearms that are like non-restricted, currently in this country, non-restricted, and make them prohibited by, administratively by the stroke of a pen, not with evidence that suggests that they are a danger to the public, not with evidence to suggest that the Canadians who own them are now a danger to the public, only because of some ideological push. I guess you can choose to answer this or not, and you're wise enough, you've been around long enough to know whether you will or you won't, but those of you who may or may not have a PAL or an RPAL, those of you who may or may not hunt, do you not find this to be like a conflict to what actually goes on in real life in this country?
We're here.
Or do you have to put that aside?
So we're here to answer questions regarding Bill C-21 and the motions before us.
That's a pretty definitive C-21 question.
You're asking me a personal question.
Point of order, Chair.
Fair enough.
Ms. DeMoff, on a point of order?
Yeah, the officials are here not to give their opinion and not to justify policy made by the government. They're
They'd have a
here
tough
to
time
answer
doing that,
questions.
wouldn't
Mr. Motz, please don't interrupt me. They're here to answer
Mr. Motz, Ms. DeMoff is recognized on a point of order. Please carry on.
They're here to answer questions on the legislation, not to offer personal opinions, not to offer opinions on policy of the government. And so if Mr. Motz is going to ask questions, I will say Mr. Lloyd was very much on point when he was doing that. And perhaps Mr. Motz can take some lessons from Mr. Lloyd on how to ask specific questions.
Thank you for your intervention, Ms. DeMoff. I would certainly remind Mr. Motz that our witnesses today are here to answer technical questions on this bill and amendments as we are addressing them. They are, of course, government lawyers and bound by client solicitor privilege as well as cabinet confidence by time. So please try and keep within those boundaries and recognize and respect our witnesses on that basis. So, Mr. Mott, you still have the floor. Go ahead.
Thank you very much, Chair, and I very much do respect the witnesses that are before us. And I appreciate the refereeing from the sideline from across the way. So I do have a couple. I do have a couple of questions. I was pleasantly pleased to see that Premier Scott Moe and our Alberta Minister of Justice, Tyler Shandro, have issued statements that in the coming weeks that they will explore options on actions against this particular legislation and the government. We heard, Minister Mendocino at the beginning of the study suggest that the C-21 relies heavily on provincial cooperation. So how does the government plan to enact the sweeping ban, if you will, that will impact hundreds of thousands of Canadians all across this country without assistance from the provinces? How do you envision seeing that happen? Anybody have any ideas?
Thank you for your question. So in terms of how the legislation would be implemented in terms of if there is a prohibition, if it is passed and it receives royal assent, and when it comes into force, there are legal ways in terms of legal means to dispose of firearms through either surrender to police, by legal export, and by deactivation.
Okay, so then would that imply that, and I know you can't determine when the government is going to have this come into force, right? And I get that. So that would indicate that maybe this is going to be a long-term process. They're going to need to get their ducks in a row, pardon the pun, on dealing with how are we actually going to deal with, millions potentially of now prohibited firearms. Would that be fair? You're going to take time to do it?
So I think it would be difficult for us to comment in terms of, there's a lot of theoreticals and hypotheticals in trying to answer that question.
Okay, fair enough. I don't know if this was asked on Tuesday, and I don't remember if my colleagues asked it, but given the sweeping changes that this has to C-21, and all legislation is supposed to be charter compliant, was the new changes, so C-21, I'm sure, had a charter compliance component to it. Is that correct?
That's correct.
So has the charter compliance been done on the amendments to this particular legislation?
So I believe on Tuesday I'd answered the same or similar question. There was a charter.
I'm old. I have a bad memory.
That's okay. Me too. There was a charter statement that was tabled with the bill in June of 2022. And with respect to any legislation that the department brings forward, the Minister of Justice has a responsibility to ensure that it is compliant with the charter in accordance with the Department of Justice Act.
Now my memory comes back and you answered almost identical to what you did on Tuesday. But my question was, has a charter compliance analysis been done on specifically on G4 and specifically, and then in reference to G46, because, G4 number I talks about the firearms listed in that schedule. Has the charter compliance been done on the expansion of C21?
So again, any legislation or motions that the government would bring forward, the Minister of Justice is responsible to ensuring compliance with the charter for any amendments, legislation that is before Parliament.
So again, has one been done on the amendments? Because I'm asking because I haven't seen it.
So any analysis that would be done at an official's level would be subject to solicitor-client privilege and cabinet confidence with respect to the drafting and advice with respect to motions, et cetera, on legislation.
Okay, so can the Canadian public ever expect a charter compliance document to be released on the amendments?
There's an obligation to release a charter statement with the introduction of a bill only.
So, well, that's rather convenient, don't you think? And again, this is very convenient, so that we can have a charter compliance document prepared for a bill, then we can completely change the bill, completely change it. And like this is a firearm freeze bill or a handgun freeze bill. That's how it started, right? And now we're prohibiting, hundreds of thousands of now previously non-restricted firearms. The scope is completely changed.
Point of order, Chair.
Ms. Demoff, on a point
The
of order,
list was
please.
made public this morning. To say hundreds of thousands does not reflect what was in the list this morning. So let's be clear and stick to facts
There's
here.
hundreds of models, but it impacts hundreds of thousands of firearms across this country.
Ms. Demoff has the floor. Is your point complete?
Yes, Chair, but when I'm speaking, I would appreciate it if Mr. Motz would let me finish. I'm not interrupting him when he's speaking, so if he could just give me the courtesy and respect of letting me finish my statement. There are not hundreds of thousands of firearms that are on the list that was made public today with Mr. Chang's
Thank you,
motion.
Ms. Demoff, and I would urge Mr. Motz to recognize the speaker when it's appropriate. Carry on, please.
Thank you. So let me rephrase it. There are hundreds of thousands of firearms impacted by the hundreds of models listed here. Would that be correct? Firearms reference table. You guys in public safety, you probably have it all memorized, don't you?
with respect, my memory is good, but not quite that good. So in terms of the evergreen definition, reflects the government's policy objective of enhancing public safety and ensuring that all assault-style firearms are treated the same in law. The definition captures many firearms that are already prohibited by regulation, but would also be forward-looking and capture ASFs that may come to market in the future. No list exists that identifies all of the firearms that would be captured only by the proposed definition in 84(1)G. However, I'll provide some examples of firearms that are already prohibited in regulations by make and models that would be captured by the proposed qualitative definition. And those include the AR-15 rifle, the Ruger Mini 14 rifle, the CZ-858 rifle, Beretta CX-4 Storm carbine, and the Norinco M305 rifle. And I'll also provide some examples of firearms that are prohibited in the regulations by make and model, but would not be captured by the proposed qualitative definition. For example, the Army Jagger AP-74 is not a center fire. DPMS A-15 Panther pump rifle is not a semi-automatic. Mitchell Arms M16/22, it is not center fire. Rock River Arms LAR-15 pistol is not a rifle nor a shotgun. And the SIG MCX Rattler pistol is neither a rifle or a shotgun.
So I'll ask the question in a different way. The Ordering Council from May of 2020 prohibited most of the firearms that you've already listed, correct?
Oh, thank you. So it captured about 1,500 names, named models, makes and models.
And since the Ordering Council, there's been, again, hundreds of firearms listed, added to that through the firearms program in the two and a half years since it was put out.
So as the criteria that were put up, as they're reviewing the Canadian Firearms Program, as they're reviewing the firearms reference table, they perform a manual update of that table to reflect those same criteria to identifying firearms that meet those criteria.
So it's interesting that the definition that you read, that is a department position that you have on public safety, that there's an arbitrary definition there that includes, or that seems to suggest that the firearms now being considered for prohibition are somehow military-style assault rifles. Is that true? That's the wording that you read to us. Can you just read? There's 2 or 3 sentences there. Can you just reread that for me, please?
So in terms of the definition that is being proposed in G?
No, not in G. I have G in front of me. I'm talking about what you just read about your department position on why you're prohibiting some of these weapons, or you have firearms, or you have them on your list.
Right.
It's specific to public safety.
So in terms of the proposed evergreen definition, proposes its qualitative definition that would prohibit firearms that meet that definition. The definition includes a rifle or shotgun.
No. I'm not talking about what's in G. I'm talking about the statement you read from the department just at the very beginning of your intervention, your response back to me.
Okay. So in terms of that paragraph G reflects the government's policy objective of enhancing public safety and ensuring that all assault-style firearms are treated the same in law.
Okay, that's the one I'm looking for. Thank you. So assault-style firearms are so a firearm right now, a non-restricted firearm is going to be classified as a prohibited firearm because some ideologue somewhere said that it's a military-style assault weapon. That's really what we're saying here, right?
So there is no definition of assault-style firearm in law. But what has been to date is the ability of the Governor and Council to establish criteria on which in which the May 1st, 2020 OIC prohibited a list by make and model of firearms.
So when the government,
I haven't finished, sorry.
oh, sorry.
So this criteria, which was publicly stated after the introduction of the bills, was made clear that the factors that were looked at was that it was capable of sustained semi-automatic rapid fire, and it had to be of a tactical or military design with the capability of accepting a large magazine, which would be an oversized magazine, therefore like 5 and above,
Right.
above 5.
Okay, but having a magazine in a firearm like as you describe over 5 is a prohibited device in this country already.
You're correct. The magazine itself is a prohibited device, but what the May 1st OIC sought to prohibit is the firearm that can receive the prohibited device.
Wow, I know what it's asking for, what it's suggesting, but you don't like consider that a significant overreach of really what the design is. Like firearms need to be classified, like I said on Tuesday, of what they can do, not by what they look like.
So
Because you said they look like.
no, I didn't. What I said, that's not, sorry. What I said is that the firearms were prohibited according to what they can do, which is the semi-automatic, sustained rapid fire, based on a military or tactical design, and capable of accepting a large capacity magazine.
So what you're describing really is an automatic, a full automatic firearm.
What I'm describing is a semi-automatic version of a military or tactical designed
In
firearm.
Canada, that semi-automatic firearm right now has a maximum capacity magazine allowable under law of 5.
That is one way in which public safety is taken into consideration with respect to firearms, is that limitation on magazine capacity. The government has made a decision to further ban assault-style firearms or further protect public safety by also prohibiting the firearms that can accept oversized cartridge magazines.
So have in preparation for this bill, which began a couple years ago, I'm sure, was there any evidence that was provided that supports the government's decision? I mean, we always hear this government brag about it in words only, not necessarily in action, but in words, that they base their decisions on evidence. They call it evidence-based decision-making. And I think it's actually decision-based evidence-making is really what I think they probably adhere to mostly. But did they provide you any factual evidence that says, here's the evidence that these now, on this list, 400, on the other list that came out in 2020, May of 2020, 1,500 plus hundreds more since then, that they pose, all of them pose a significant risk to public safety.
That's the determination based on the ability of these firearms to perform sustained rapid fire based on the semi-automatic capability
It's not
combined with
sustained rapid fire. Like
sustained rapid fire.
Mr. Motz,
when
please.
you look at a
Mr. Van Bynen on point of order.
Should allow the witness to finish their statements. It's rude to interrupt them.
Thank you, Mr. Van Bynen. I was just about to say that. So please, Mr. Motz, if you ask a question, please wait for the answer.
Thank you. So what I'm hearing you say is that because we don't have no definition of a military-style assault weapon, that's a made-up term by this government, we will now try and fit firearms into that definition. And in so doing, we have identified non-restricted firearms into that list because of someone's misunderstanding of firearms and the laws that we have in this country. Now, as I understand it, I've talked to Canadian military and American military folks, and who laugh at this definition. A military-style assault rifle is a rifle that is capable of fully automatic fire with large capacity magazines, that's a military style assault rifle. Now, by any definition. Now, what this government is trying to do through this legislation, going from a handgun freezing bill to a all-encompassing, let's just eliminate all firearms, basically, is what they're doing. They are including now a whole brand of and a whole type of firearm that otherwise was non-restricted. And with little thought to the impact that has on culture and the heritage of many Canadians. Now, I wanted to ask you a question specific about variants, if I could.
Sure.
Now, how does the department or you as writers, drafters, how do you define a variant?
So a variant is, the way a variant is interpreted is based on a plain language interpretation of the meaning, which is then applied by technical experts as they examine a firearm to see if it comes from the same family as a firearm that is already prohibited pursuant to the regulations. But there is no definition in the...
There is no definition in legislation.
No.
Yet it's used throughout the firearms reference table.
Yes.
And you said it's common, what's the word you used? Not common knowledge.
The common uses of the term.
Common uses of the term. So can you describe for me what a variant of, you can pick a firearm, but like how would we get from a designed firearm, manufactured the way it is, and now it's all of a sudden on this prohibited list, and it now becomes, how do you get a variant of that? Is it from a manufacturer, or is it from an individual themselves doing the variant? How would that look?
So this technical question is sort of outside of my lane. This is a question that's best directed to the Canadian Firearms Program. But what I can tell you is that they do look at a range of factors and when making their technical determination, including manufacturing, information, and marketing. But I would indicate that this question should be answered by the Canadian Firearms Program.
Fair enough. So, in your earlier testimony, and the way this act reads and what this government's history has been, of the 500 plus firearms that are listed in 46 on Government Amendment 46, what you're telling me basically is that all the variants, every possible variant known to mankind now or into the future, will be prohibited of anything related to those 500 firearms here. And this list is not exhaustive. Am I true in saying that too? Like right now, this is an exhaustive list. But that doesn't mean that the government can't continue to keep adding firearms to this like they've done the Order in Council. Is that correct?
So the list is exhaustive to the best of the knowledge of the Canadian Firearms Program. And the term variant would capture any firearm that's produced by manufacturers in the future that are essentially from the same family as a firearm that is currently prohibited. And that is to prevent manufacturers from changing the name of a firearm that is essentially the same as a firearm that's prohibited.
So what that effectively does in legislation is of the hundreds of 500 plus firearms listed on this particular table or amendment that the Liberals are adding now to the already a couple thousand firearms that are prohibited under the Order in Council, that every possible variant moving forward of that is automatically prohibited. So what you're trying to do is, and you use the word manufacturers, so this is mostly related to manufacturers. So hunting rifles, as we know it now, that whole industry, that whole practice of it is basically going to end under this legislation if it passes. Is that what I'm hearing you say?
So I can answer legal questions.
Yeah, please do.
So the proposed schedule, the firearms that are listed that you have in front of you. Schedule 1 lists all of the firearms that are currently prohibited in the regulations. Okay. Added to those are all of the known variants, and those were included for transparency, so that when Canadians look at the schedule, they will know what firearms are prohibited based on the best knowledge of the Canadian Firearms Program. So that's what's been done so far with respect to variants. Moving forward in the future, should a manufacturer choose to produce a firearm that is essentially, for all intents and purposes, the same firearm that is prohibited in the schedule, that would be captured by the term variant, and then that firearm would be prohibited. And so that's to ensure that manufacturers are not able to manufacture a firearm that's essentially the same as a prohibited firearm.
So the bottom line here is we again, and I'll use a term, and this is not necessarily a question to give you a break, but a statement, is that the government is not looking at the function of a firearm. They're looking at what it looks like. And I guess case in point about why we ask about the variant is the Mossberg 715T is a 22 caliber rifle, all right? It's identical in structure and operation to the Mossberg 702 rifle. The one difference is where the Mossberg 702 has a traditional wood-looking stock on the exterior, the 715T has a plastic shell that's designed to look like an AR-15. So we've effectively said this government is classifying firearms by how they look. They look scary. We're going to make sure that we prohibit them, and that was a lot of what the Order in Council was about. And it certainly is something that causes consternation now. And what's interesting, and on Tuesday when this was released to the public in the fact that the motion was made here at committee, there were significant people from around the country who went out and were sharing the concerns of the public. I know that my phone and my emails have certainly picked up about this issue, and the Canadian public feels deceived. We had many ministers and members of the government speak in Parliament and at this committee and elsewhere about, they're not going after hunters and the hunter and sport shooters. I mean, they're not going after any of this. There'll be no impact on we're trying to make the public safe. We're trying to, deal with gangs and criminals. But I don't know how many gang members are worried about this legislation. And yet we don't seem to be focusing any attention on what gangs are doing. I know Ms. Dancho mentioned earlier about the billions of dollars that this particular bill will actually cost if the government considers any confiscation plan whatsoever. I don't think they will. I just think they'll ram this through and screw the public. They'll just forget the Canadian Bill of Rights. They will take property, make it illegal, and that way circumvent any responsibility they have to compensate people for this. But just think of what that would do if we had even $1 billion that we give to legitimate programs that make a difference on kids getting involved in gangs. Like my friend Marcel that we had here at committee on Marcel Wilson from the One by One movement. They're making huge inroads in Toronto area. Law enforcement on porous areas of our border that law enforcement knows right now are the main vehicles by which smuggled firearms enter this country. We need to have those resources deployed there to deal with the smuggled firearms out of the U.S. And to deal with kids getting involved in gangs in the first place. A couple years back, the now Minister of Public Safety, Marco Mendocino, and I were on the, and Pam, I'm sure you'll love this, we were on political blind date. And I know it's an odd couple. Marco and I were on a blind date together. I'm not too proud of saying it, but he's actually not a bad guy if you get rid of his politics. But anyway, so the idea is that TV Ontario did this particular program, and we talked about firearms. So I had the privilege of having Marco out in my riding in Medicine Hat, Alberta, and we went to a certified firearm instructor, and he provided some, an abbreviated lesson on what firearms are about and how safe the industry is and what vigor people have to go through to get a PAL, and how much increased that vigor is when you get to an RPAL, restricted possession acquisition license, and which I have both, by the way. And so we, Marco went through this, and even during our presentation, the firearm instructor has students handle firearms, so they have a familiarity with them. Marco refused to participate, and that's his choice. Then we went out to a gun range, the Medicine Hat Rifle and Revolver Club, a great club in Medicine Hat, run by a great group of people. And we had some people from industry, some hunters there. We had some gun shops there. We had some individuals who participate in varying sport shooting disciplines there. And the idea is to show, Marco Mendocino what vigor they go through for safety on the range. And so it was great. And then I had the privilege of going down and seeing Marco in his riding. And we went down to a number of different areas. Lawrence Heights was one of them. And, we played a little basketball with some street kids, and we had a great time. But one of the things that really struck me is we went to a housing project where a young mom recounted the story of her two young daughters. I believe they're both under the age of 8, and they were shot in a gang shooting. Now, thankfully, they were not killed, but they were both, and both will have trauma, I'm sure, for a lifetime. And I asked this lady, so as legislators in Parliament, what should we be doing to make a difference for public safety in this country, being you and your family are front and center in being victims of this? And unfortunately, this particular dialogue, they still have it on their tapes, but it didn't air, which I'm not surprised, but it didn't air. She goes, the gangbangers in this city are not afraid of law enforcement. They're not afraid of the law. Nothing happens to them. And I said, so how do we change that? And, Marco was getting very nervous by this stage. And she said, there needs to be serious accountability to those people in this country who use firearms in the commission of an offense. And there is not. There is no accountability for them. And so I find it rather disconcerting that, again, we have a bill in front of us that does little. It's like lipstick on a pig. It looks like it does something beautiful, but it actually makes no difference on public safety. That's not your fault. You have to do the dance to the music that your masters play, and I get it. But as I said on Tuesday, I'm very concerned about what this will do to industry that contributes, as has been indicated by my colleagues, significant dollars, billions of dollars to our GDP, that impacts the lives and careers and businesses of a multitude of Canadians, tens of thousands of Canadians, and then millions of Canadians who have the exact firearms that that the government is trying to prohibit here, that have now become worthless and overnight will be turned into administrative criminals. And that's what the term needs to be called. They will become administrative criminals. Why? They didn't commit an offense. They didn't go out and harm anybody. They're not at risk to anybody, not at all. Because on a piece of paper, somebody said, we don't agree that these firearms should be owned by anyone because we can't find any evidence to show that that the 514 firearms and their variants listed, all of them, that they're a danger to the public. Because guns aren't a danger to the public. Thank you. People are. And the people use of them are. And that's what we have to try and do. So I would love to, and I would be joining government in supporting any legislation that we can work together on that says we have a problem with gangs, we have a problem with smuggled firearms, we have a problem with reduced sentencing and gun crimes aren't taken seriously. We have a revolving justice door system that keeps people out of jail more than it keeps them in. I remember when I started policing in 1980, that's probably before you were born, Paul, but but when I started policing in 1980, we had a thing called the Bail Reform Act that actually did something. So it was called reverse onus, and Paul will remember that. So if I charged somebody with a criminal offense and that person was able to get out on bail, they had conditions. And those conditions laid out a whole series of...
Mr. Mott, this is all very interesting.
No, it's
but you're
getting back
kind
to
of
the
wandering
firearms.
around. Can we get right back, if we could,
Absolutely.
to G4?
Yeah, absolutely. So what the Bail Reform Act did back then was allow criminals to be accountable. Not allow, it provided that the criminals be accountable. So if they were released on a condition, whatever they might be, and they reoffend, the onus is on then that criminal to show why they should be released. And now that whole system seems to have shifted so that the criminals no longer have to show why they should remain in custody if they reoffend. It's up to the Crown, the police, of why that individual should remain in custody. Like, it's gone backwards. And, when we get in government, I'm anxious to see you ladies working to try and change some of those things. So stay tuned for that. And that'll be something that I look forward to. Anyway, I will cede my time for what's left to Mr. Shipley, and I think he's on the list, is he not?
Thank you. You don't have time to cede. I will recognize next Mr. Nur Mohammed, and Mr. Shipley is following Mr. Nur Mohammed. So, Mr. Nur Mohammed, please go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. There's a lot to unpack from this filibuster that we were promised we would not have to sit through, because we were told by our conservative friends that they intended to move forward on this and not delay it unreasonably. And so it's good to know where we are. I just wanted to begin at the very beginning, in fact, with what Ms. Damoff said at the beginning. On January 29th, we're going to be marking the anniversary of the shooting of the Quebec City Mosque. And I want to remind everyone that that weapon was acquired legally, and the heinous murders that were committed there, despite those that may believe that it's okay to consider these things outliers and that we shouldn't legislate to stop outlier events, that attack and others like it have caused irreparable damage to communities, not just in Quebec City, but Muslim communities across this country. And so I think when we do talk about the impact of firearms violence, we can't forget why this legislation is so very important. Ms. Dancho spoke about her grandfather, and I want to express my condolences to her. I was very close to my grandfather, and so these are important memories for us to hold on to. But I wanted to share something that my grandfather taught me as somebody who was very lucky to have come to this country. He said, the beauty of Canada is that Canada evolves. Canada is a dynamic country, and Canada's evolution as a country has made it better. And so when Ms. Dancho talks about Canadian culture, I think it's very important to know that Canadian culture evolves over time as we embrace the richness of its diversity, as we embrace the richness of the diversities that we learn from Indigenous communities in this country, from those that have been here since Mr. Lloyd's family came when there were 13 colonies, and from when my family came 50 years ago. But when we talk about the evolution of this country, there is a time in this country when women couldn't vote, when Indigenous people couldn't vote, when Indigenous people needed passes to come off reserves, when we imposed head taxes, when same-sex marriage was not allowed, when racial segregation was the order of the day. And so I think it's really important for us to understand the importance of evolving and that we learn from the past to make a better future. And this legislation, in my opinion, and this amendment, in my opinion, does that. And the beauty of our legislative process, Mr. Chair, is that if the Conservatives think that this is a terrible amendment, they have the ability in this minority parliament to work with two other parties to defeat this amendment. That is their right. That is the beauty of this parliamentary process, not to hold up the will of Canadians. It is their opportunity to work with other parties to defeat this amendment if they don't like it. But my goodness, Mr. Speaker, we are here to try and save lives. We are here to try and do what is right. And we are not here to take away weapons from hunters that use the weapons that, as Ms. Demoff rightly stated, are available for the purpose of hunting. And this may be a surprise to many on the Conservative side, but there are hunters that support this legislation. There are those of us who may not be gun owners who understand that for those gun owners for whom this is important, their rights are important as well. But what this bill does is very much different from what the Conservatives are asserting it's doing. You know, Mr. Lloyd spoke to, before I get to Mr. Lloyd, I also want to note the glee with which Conservative staffers were literally bouncing around in the hallways, thanking people for how much fodder this was going to create for fundraising opportunities. And I am surprised and disappointed that the party that purports to be in support of law and order would use a debate around keeping Canadians safe as an opportunity to raise money. And I think we should all take a good long look and reflect on what that actually says about the nature of the conversation here. You know, Mr. Lloyd rightly spoke about the importance of freedoms. But it's very striking to me, that when Mr. Lloyd spoke about being a Canadian patriot and about rejecting revolution, I didn't see him speaking about rejecting the convoy, rejecting his convoy,
Point of order,
his
Mr.
colleagues
Chair.
that were there. Mr. Speaker, this is Mr. Chair. This is in
Mr.
direct
Lloyd is
response to what Mr. Lloyd
recognized.
said.
Mr. Lloyd is recognized on a point of order.
I don't see any relevance to this, Mr. Chair. I mean, this isn't related to the amendment at all. Now he's talking about
If I
the
might be allowed to
convoy.
finish, Mr. Chair, you'd see where I'm going with this.
Thank you, Mr. Lloyd, for your point of order. I think we've seen considerable latitude to talk about our origins and our connection to this country, so I will certainly let it. Continuing on your point of order, Garrett, go ahead.
I would never deem to question the patriotism of any member of this committee, and I would just urge my colleague, Mr. Nur Mohammed, not to make any implication that I myself, who also serves as a member of the Canadian Forces, am not a patriot of this country. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you for your intervention. Mr. Nur Mohammed, the floor is yours again. Carry on.
Thank you, Mr. And I want to be clear. At no point am I questioning Mr. Lloyd's patriotism. Quite the opposite. I know him to be a proud Canadian, and I share many of the things that he holds dear. But I do want to make a point here that I think is important as we talk about this amendment. When we speak about rights, and we speak about the importance of rejecting revolution, you know, we need to be clear that this is something that we hold true on all the things that we talk about. You know, and so whether it is rejecting those that sought to overthrow the government, we should be standing firm. And so what I want to say really is very much about the idea of when we talk about freedoms, why it's important that we understand limitations sometimes. You know, the Conservative Party was prepared to launch a niqab ban against women who chose to wear the niqab. They have been adamant in their fight against a woman's right to choose. Whatever we want to talk about when it comes to freedoms here, let's be very, very clear. This is not about that. This is about something very, very different. And if we are going to if we're going to go down a rabbit hole here of talking about freedom, I think it's really, really important that freedom is not license. And we have to be very deliberate when we are talking about guns and the violence that are perpetrated by those that choose to use guns as a tool of violence to actually realize what some of these weapons are. So, you know, there was a lot of debate about the innocuous nature of the SKS. And so I think it's important for us to understand that the SKS is, in fact, a weapon that has been used in military conflicts. And if we want to just take a look at what some of those military conflicts might be, and this is not by no means an exhaustive list, and if people would like, I'm happy to provide them a much longer exhaustive list. But that exhaustive list, and I'm just going to pull it up here, Mr. Chair, involves everything from the Donbass conflict that we've seen very recently, all the way back to the Boer War. It's been used in Vietnam. It's been used in the Suez Crisis. It's been used. Many times, and it was used in 1990 in the Tuareg Rebellion through 1995. It was used in the Soviet-Afghan War. It was used in the war in Abkhazia. It was used in the Algerian Civil War. So for people to say this is not a weapon of war is patently untrue. It has been used by forces in war. And so I think let's be very, very honest with people about what is actually going on here. What I find remarkable, Mr. Chair, is that we have not heard one single speaker from the Conservative side look at this list and acknowledge any weapon on there that deserves to be banned. So I'm listening to this and wondering, for folks that are so concerned about public safety, why they haven't gone through this list and said, yeah, we actually agree that a large number of these should be banned. Is it because they believe every single weapon on there should have free and fair license on our streets? I'd love to know that. I'd love to know if that's the case. Because if it is, I think that would give us something more to reflect on. So when we think about the sort of this view that we should be tougher on crime and we should be tougher on weapons at the borders, let's just remind ourselves of record. During the last Conservative government, over $1 billion was cut from law enforcement agencies. RCMP labs that were reviewing firearms and tracing evidence for police forces were slashed. Entire proceeds of crimes units were disbanded. Resources were taken away from CBSA and their ability to control the flow of illegal goods, including firearms at the borders that our Conservative friends are so concerned about. And they talked about the crime prevention programs. Mr. Chair, the programs that they talked about before the 2015 election, the National Crime Prevention Strategy, they let money lapse from those programs. Didn't fund $28 million of the money that they said they were going to put into crime prevention. So we sit here listening to how we've done this terrible job of not protecting our borders when, in fact, we have been trying to make back the ground that was lost on the Conservatives. 2021, we put over $656 million back into the budget to keeping this country safe. $123 million for CBSA. We put money into tracing. We put money into making sure that there was a mandatory tracing policy. The things that we have had to do to reverse the total ignorance around law and order of the Conservative government of the past continues to work, and Bill C-21 is a part of that. So the idea that the Conservatives are good on crime and law and order is absolute nonsense, and their record speaks for it. So I will take no lessons from Conservatives who talk about the importance of protecting every single one of these weapons, because it is somehow part of Canadian culture that we should be able to do this. Let's talk about Canadian culture for a moment. Let's talk about the importance of Canadian culture. Yes, absolutely. Hunting is a big part of people's lives. And I want to take nothing away from Ms. Dancho's families or families like hers. They have a right to hunt, as do Indigenous communities. Nobody is questioning that. But let's talk about this for a moment in the spirit with which Mr. Motz and others have spoken about it. The Conservatives proposed a barbaric cultural practices line. Had that come through when they were in government, I wonder if today people who opposed hunting could say that hunting should be reported in through their snitch line as a barbaric cultural practice. Is that the road that we are trying to go down here? I don't think so. We're trying to be reasonable. So the list of weapons that is there, I invite my Conservative friends to go through it and acknowledge perhaps that there are weapons on that list that should be banned. But this idea that we should go to a world in which every single weapon should be on our streets because guns don't kill people, people do, is absurd. We heard from law enforcement that guns in the hands of that the wrong types of guns in the wrong type of hands kill people. Sometimes guns in the hands of people inadvertently end up killing people. So let's get to the facts here. And the facts are that the Conservatives are using this to raise money. They are using this to advance fear among Canadians, to divide Canadians. They talked about not having this politics of division, Mr. Chair. That is exactly what this is about. People are running through hallways gleeful that this provides fodder for fundraising. We have a real problem. And I would argue that we have an opportunity here to actually, as we have done in this committee in the past, work together. To work together as we did on the ghost amendments, as the first couple and the parts rather. And as I know we're going to, because I know that Mr. Shipley, I know that others on this committee believe strongly that we need to deal with some of these issues. We may have disagreements, but the beauty of this committee, Mr. Chair, is that if they disagree with an amendment, they have the right to work with other parties to defeat this amendment. But they should not hold the process of debating this and having meaningful conversation on this just because it serves a political agenda. There are people in my riding that support this. There are probably people in my riding that oppose this. But the overwhelming number of Canadians sent us to this place to deal with this in the way that we have agreed to deal with it. And I would really encourage the Conservatives, if they are opposed to this, see if they can get the support of other parties. But if they can't, let the will of Canadians move this bill forward. And let's actually get to the parts of this that we can agree on. Let's get some good legislation passed. But let's not waste Canadians' time. Let's not create moments here for social media clips that allow people to go and raise money. Let's not use language like Canadians are going to be up in arms and this is a declaration of war, because it's not. Using language like it's a declaration of war is not what Canadians want to hear from people that are elected. They want to hear that we can find ways to actually communicate with one another in a way that does not hot people up, does not cause further friction, further animus, does not cause people on social media to start to vilify people. That's not why we are here. So again, as we think about what is the best path forward, I don't doubt that every single person on this committee, Mr. Chair, actually cares about moving forward in protecting Canadians' lives. We may have different means. But I take great umbrage to use of language like this is a war against people. Canadians are going to be up in arms over this. This is not right. And we have seen the consequences of that when people like Ms. Demoff have been threatened. That is not okay. So I would really encourage us all, if we are going to look at these amendments and talk about them thoughtfully, instead of questioning instead of questioning officials and asking for them for their personal opinions, let's ask them technical questions as Mr. Lloyd did. But when I look at this list, I want to hear from my Conservative friends which of the weapons they actually do think should be banned. Which of the guns do they think should be banned so that we can actually start to save lives? Let's have a conversation about substance. That is, in my view, the most important thing that we can do, and Canadians, frankly, deserve it. This should not be a database building exercise for Conservatives. This should not be a fundraising exercise. This should be something that we look at as we have so many other things before this committee, and look at it in ways that we can find common ground. And I want to be very clear, and I speak for myself here. There is no sinister plot, at least that I have seen or that I am a part of, to take reasonable hunting guns away from those that have a right to hunt. This is not some sinister plot to punish Indigenous communities, as the Conservatives assert. This is not some insidious plot to destroy the rich culture and heritage of Ms. Dancho's family. That is not what this is about. And to stir Canadians up into thinking that we are coming for the things that they hold dear is not right. What we are doing is we are taking weapons that are used in wars, that are used in mass shootings, that are used in killing innocent people of all races and faiths. That is what we are trying to do here. And we've sat quietly and we have listened to Mr. Mott's wax poetic about how, Minister Mendocino might have felt. Let me tell you what I know about what I have heard from the victims of the mosque shooting and from other shootings like it. They felt that it was the responsibility of a government, liberal, conservative, New Democrat, Green, Bloc, otherwise, to protect them from the very tools that were used to murder them. That is what families of victims keep telling us. That is what our responsibility is. whether it is ghost guns, whether it is illegal guns at the border, whether it is many of the weapons on this list. Our job is to make sure that we are protecting lives.
Point of
Our
order,
job
Mr.
is to
Chair.
do our part.
I apologize for interrupting. I do have a few.
Ms. Stancho on a point of order?
I do have a few logistical questions about committee that I need to ask before we wind up for today. So I just want to, I don't know how long Mr. Nur Mohammed is going to speak, but I do have some legitimate technical questions about meeting times to ask you about.
So, Mr. Numa, we are coming up to the end of our time. It's 1:25. We turn into pumpkins at 1:30. So I don't know if Mr. Nur Mohammed, if you're ready to pause there and maybe resume in our next meeting, or whether you want to carry on for a little bit longer.
Well, I'm happy to pause and then continue at the beginning of the next meeting, if that is the will of the chair. If there are logistical questions to be answered, I'm happy to pause for those, but I would then like to begin my time at the beginning of the next meeting.
All right. In that case, Ms. Stancho, let me just preempt perhaps what you have to say. Is the next couple of meetings certainly will be on this bill. There'll be a regular time slot, regular time. So.
Can I speak now? Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I apologize, Mr. Tlaib, or Mr. Nur Mohammed, for interrupting. So I just want to address a few things, Mr. Chair. So on Tuesday and then today, there was additional time scheduled to these meetings, which I recognize we have those capabilities, and there certainly can be legitimate reasons for scheduling that additional time. But, Mr. Chair, as the Vice Chair and the lead of the opposition on this committee, I would ask that you consistently reach out to me when you plan to schedule extra time. I do believe I deserve the dignity of being asked, or at least made aware. I believe you did mention it at the beginning today, though you did not do so on Tuesday. If it's the will of the committee, we can go over time. But again, I believe we should be making that formal and voting, if need be, to expand the time. I do feel, Mr. Chair, and I know that you've been the chair now just for a little bit, but I would appreciate the respect provided to me to ensure that if you're going to schedule extra time, please check with me. I know that I can't veto your decision, but at the very least, I would ask that you give me as much heads up as possible. I'm not talking like the morning of or right before the notice goes out. I would like the dignity of being provided as the vice chair of this committee and the lead for the opposition. I would just ask that you provide me with the respect with giving me a heads up for that and ample discussion time. And then if we have issues, we can vote on extending the time, or if we don't, then we just carry on as we did today. But I believe that is standard procedure, and I would just ask that you honor that when it comes to me. And perhaps the other vice chairs would like to, I can't speak for them, but would like to be provided that respect as well, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Ms. Stancho, for your intervention. Sometimes these things happen on a very short notice, and you know, I know that there are often delays in this place, so that, for example, on Tuesday, we were delayed by votes by half an hour. So this is, when time comes available, I'm inclined to take it. That time came available actually because I was in the process of trying to find time for the Russia study. So, but I take your points. I will try and do better going forward. And with that, we have 2 minutes left. So I won't adjourn this meeting. I'll suspend it so that we can continue where we left off in the next meeting. And Mr. Nur Mohammed, you will have the floor at the beginning of the next meeting. So is there any other business we need to hear from? No? All right. Meeting suspended.
We'll keep the list here.
Yeah.
And we can start the next meeting.
Yeah.